So, how would you describe Martha Jane Osgood? What words, what phrases come to mind? What words or phrases do you have to describe Martha? Maybe you would like to write these down, but you have some words, you have some phrases. In the coming weeks and years, you're going to come across Valerie, and you're going to talk to Patty, or you're going to see Teresa. And maybe these are one of the words that will come to mind. You're going to walk past the Sunday school class where Martha taught, or you're going to see her name on something, or drive past her house. What words, what phrases will come to mind for you, for your memory of Martha Osgood? Today is May 9th. You could be watching this on May 10th or later, and this is Mother's Day week. So, because we live in this world and everything is marketed for whatever the week is, and everything is Mother's Day right now, maybe I have Mother's Day on my brain or something, but to me, Martha is the quintessential mother. I just recently, in the last couple of days, learned that Martha had asked all of her students, in all of her years of teaching Sunday school here at St. Stephen, to call her grandma. That was how she asked to be referred to. So maybe she's not the quintessential mother, maybe she's the grandmother, the grandest mother. What words do you have to describe Martha? Have you written those down, or do you have them in your memory? What words or phrases come to mind for you for Martha? Are there any words or phrases that come to mind for you, seeing as how we're ahead of Mother's Day, for mothers? Do those two lists overlap? If you were to think of words that describe mothers to you, does the list of words for mothers overlap the list of words that you have to remember or that remind you of Martha? A list of words to describe mothers. Mothers create, they feed, they clothe, they care, they listen, they support, they fight for, they even fret over. These are some of the words I would use to describe mothers, and maybe because mothers are on my mind so much, I could equate those with Martha and how she lived and who she is, and those two things kind of conflate in my mind. To remember Martha at her service, I selected a super unorthodox gospel. It comes from the 23rd chapter of Matthew, and I'm thinking in particular of the last few verses of that chapter. In them, Jesus, who is God in our midst, approaches finally in the story Jerusalem, and he sees it off in the distance, and he says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, and how I weep for you like a mother, and how I long to gather you under my wings like a mother hen." What words do you use to describe moms? What words would you use to describe Martha? You ever think about God being those things? Are we talking about mothers here, or are we talking about God? Yeah. Mothers create, they feed, they clothe, they care, they listen, they support, they fight for, they fret over. Is that part of the way you remember Martha and how she lived for others? Is this a list that you would use to capture moms? Well, what if I laid out there for you the idea that maybe we don't connect God with this stuff often enough? That often we see God as this stern, punishing, or mean being, but that this is actually the presence that God leads with and that predominantly describes God. And their words that have to do with mothers and Martha and mothering. And that's part of the reason why I selected this text from the 23rd chapter of Matthew. In thinking about Martha and moms and God and how these all conflate and speak to us about what it feels like to be in relationship or care or be cared for, I have another handful of words, 3 words. They fit Martha, they fit mothers, they fit God. And they have to do with part of the way that these people and that God relates to us. The words I can add to this list are patience, anticipation, and even resignation. Patience, because moms know what their kids need, but they know that sometimes moving into that and growing into what we need, or the skills or whatever that we're going to have someday, requires patience. Part of the way that I remember this is that in the last few years, I would sit with Martha, who finally had to sort of let Sam go ahead and be the primary grocery shopper for the two of them. And she would send Sam to the grocery store with a list. And it always amazed me, the humor and the patience with which she would talk about his approach to this list. It would say potatoes, and he would come back with 2 individual potatoes, and she meant, like a 10-pound bag. And it required a lot of patience and sitting with him and going back over with him that that's not really the thing that we were looking for. And I think this describes Martha and fits part of the story of how I've come to know her. I think it fits moms in general, that they have to be patient, but I think that fits who God is and how God works too. And I can't help but have all these things be conflated and get a better view of God than maybe the one we tend to hold, and even get a better view of what God is doing in our lives. But patience isn't the only thing I'm sort of stuck on. I'm also thinking about this word anticipation, that mothers, that God, that Martha constantly live preparing kids for a world that's yet to come. In the last few weeks, Martha told a story consistently of a particular student in Sunday school, and she would ask about how this student is and how they're doing. And she would say that there was all sorts of papers connected with being a Sunday school teacher, and that this kid would always come, do the papers or not, and then have them all and go running off, and she would have to go find them to give them all their papers, because she just had this anticipation that he would eventually be able to grow into the kid that kept track of all of his stuff. And this is part of what it's like to be a parent, to be a mom, to have been Martha, that you live in anticipation. To teach Sunday school for all those years is to tell the story about who God is to willing, listening kids, and to know that they may not come to the full knowledge of what that story, what that seed means that day, but you anticipate a day where in their lives connections are made and light bulbs come on, and the time that was spent here becomes meaningful there. And so this is part of the way I'm thinking about moms ahead of Mother's Day. It's part of the way I'm thinking about Martha. I can't help but conflate this with God, God's self. Patience, anticipation, creating, feeding, clothing, caring, listening, supporting, fighting for, fretting. How all of these are things that if we saw them as acts of God and things we should grow into, would become ways that we would interact with others and maybe become a better way of being. I think part of this is also this other word, resignation. That moms watch us grow and move and live through knowing that they may not be able to stop us from making all the decisions that we're going to make. I know that sometimes parenting, and I would assume particularly mothering, becomes this place where you're not always able to do everything that you would want to do for somebody, and so you get sort of resigned to the idea that in their freedom they're going to do things, but you are never going to stop taking in whatever piece of art they give you that day and treating it like it is the best piece of art ever, that no matter how bad it really is, it's going to go in a prime spot in your house because it was your kids and it's their art. But you're kind of resigned to knowing that your kids will be your kids. And I can't help but to think that maybe I have Mother's Day on the brain, but that it's easy to conflate my words of remembering Martha with the words of remembering mothering, and that it's easy to conflate the words of Martha and mothering with the idea of a mother hen that longs to gather us under the hen's wings, and that this is a descriptor for God's self. And how wrapped up all in this is this idea of mothering, and how maybe all of us would be bettered by thinking of God like this more often, and how Martha encapsulated that, and how mothers so color our world, and that they're people who create, they're people who feed and clothe, care, listen, support, fight for, and even though they fret over, they never stop upholding their kids' artwork. And I wonder if Martha lived this way, and this is a descriptor for God and the way God leads, if the world wouldn't be a better place for us to live into Martha's example and to see the way God relates as a way that maybe we could relate better to others. Worried about creating for them, feeding, clothing, caring, listening, supporting, fighting for, even in the midst of fretting. Prayerfully moving into patience and excitedly living into anticipation, willingly being resigned to the idea that we may not always be able to power people into what we want, but that by staying in contact and feeding and clothing and caring, life has this way of being mothered into beautiful places. I couldn't help myself but to choose this text, that is unorthodox as it is, from the 23rd chapter of Matthew to remember Martha. And I couldn't help that because, other than to do that, because it sort of roots us in the lead example, the primary way that God works, and it helps us remember Martha, and it also reminds us of some of the beauty of living in a world with mothers. I think if mothering is an idea that captures God, there is this way for we as humans to fall short of the example of that. I think it would be easy to take that word mother, M-O-T-H-E-R, and to easily make it smother, to add that S on the front, and to make the descriptor something else. And instead of being able to be patient and resigned, maybe being forceful, and maybe when we smother we move into fathering a little too much, and maybe sometimes God is seen as that, and maybe it's a recapturing of beauty to hear that God is grace, and grace is love, and grace is patience, and that if God leads this way, and if Martha lived this way, this is a world that you and I can lead into, and with the Spirit be bettered into. But it's also easy to take that word mother, M-O-T-H-E-R, and to lop that M off there and make it other. And instead of mothering, othering things, holding them at such a great distance that they never come close enough for us to feed or clothe or care. I think it'd be easy to know that God relates to the world this way, and to get caught up in how often we sort of fall short of these qualities and maybe move into other ones. Maybe too much we smother or other. But maybe part of the point of remembering Martha, or remembering Mother's Day, or sitting around Matthew 23, a mother hen text again, is to be moved back into this idea of mothering and how holy it is, and how it's enough of a presence. How sometimes we strive for such great things, but mothering is enough, and Martha is enough. And Mother's Day is a reminder of this, and of holiness, and being a person who creates, who feeds, who clothes, who cares, who listens, who supports, who fights for, even in the midst of fretting over. In the last few years, in particular in the last few weeks, I've watched as Martha struggled to move from mother to one that is mothered. As her physical body failed, I think at times it was difficult for her to be the quintessential mom, but know that she also was becoming a person who needed mothering on their own, and that life is this thing that takes us in two directions, mothering and being mothered. And I think there's also some hint in this story of moms and God as a mom, that to be faithful means to open yourself up to being mothered, right? That if God is a mom, that means we as kids are reminded that it's okay to be mothered, to be fed, clothed, cared for, listened, supported, fought for. And what a relief it is to know that God interacts this way, and that it's grace, and that people like Martha are set in our lives and do this for us, and that it's okay for us to accept this, and that in being created and fed and clothed, we're given this energy, this spirit, this presence, this holiness that's able to itself not smother or other, but mother and do it well. I think in Martha there is so much to describe and so much to try to capture. She lived 90 full years. But a lot of it seems to me to be about mothering, and that she seems to be this quintessential, this grandest mother. And I think that maybe is just on my mind because it's Mother's Day week, and that captures so much of relating to our world and being related to. But maybe this is also important because it reaffirms and recaptures for us who God is and how God primarily acts in our world. Not always as a power, but often as a mother. And so today, in remembering Martha, I look back in how I've known her and how I describe her. Patience, anticipating more, resigned to knowing the world doesn't always go as it would or should. That the descriptors for Martha and moms are creators and feeders and clothers and carers. But this is also who God is, and that wrapped up in our life are the opportunities to do these things for others, but also for God to lead with them and do them for us. And remembering Martha, I think over the years of her life, and I know that we can comfortably say, well done, good and faithful servant, mom, grandmom. But I also am drawn to the idea that moms and God work like this, and that life doesn't always have to be fractured and combative and finger pointing, but that part of it is mothering and in being mothered. And if we were to follow into the example of this that Martha provides more often, how much freer and more beautiful our world would be. So to Martha, I'm thinking today, well done, good and faithful servant. To all mothers, I'm saying thank you for who you are, and for God's self, I'm being reminded that God leads with these things and not something else. With the presence of creating, of feeding, of clothing, caring, listening, supporting, fighting for, gracefulness. And I hope in remembering Martha and knowing now that she's gone and a void opens up, that you and I may live into this very being of God, that filled with the Holy Spirit, we too may be mothered by God, God's self, but also given the strength and led into a joyful place where, like Martha, we mother others well. Martha, well done, good and faithful servant. Mothers, thank you. All of us, may we be mothered, allow ourselves to be, and may we, filled with God's grace, know that there is abundance of these mother descriptors, and that we may live into them and offer them to the world around us. May we be people who create, who see people's artwork as the greatest thing and put in the most prime spot in our homes simply because it exists. May we feed, clothe, care, listen, support, and even fight for others. And in so doing, may we move into the memory of Martha and all moms, and into the reality, the primary way that God's kingdom looks. Amen.